Okay, so the first thing we need to do to get started on our maple leaf earrings is to cut out your little template. So you're going to have a paper similar to one of these that are just cut out kind of roughly for you in a circle. You're going to take that and you're going to trim it quite well so that there's, you know, barely any white showing. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect, but you want to get pretty close because we're going to be following that outside line. The next thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be gluing it onto our piece of stabilizer. So everyone's going to get a piece of stabilizer, and the idea is to glue it onto your stabilizer so you end up with something sort of like this, sort of centered in your piece. And the idea is you don't want to trim your stabilizer to be right up against your template, or you'll have nothing to hold on to. So right now, going to bead onto this, I can hold onto these outside pieces, any of these corners, right? And then I can bead without my hands obstructing the actual piece itself. So I'm going to glue that on. I'm using my Fabri-Tac glue. You can get this at like Fabriclands, or I think even Walmart's, Michael's, stuff like that. So use some of this, and the trick is you don't want to use a ton, right? You don't want to put so much glue that it builds up and creates a hard kind of barrier that becomes tough for your needle to go through. So use it sparingly. The idea is your beads are going to hold this template on very well. You just want enough to hold it on there so it doesn't peel off as you work on it. Because once it's beaded, it's not going anywhere. Okay, so glue that on, not too thick. You can use the nozzle just to kind of smear the glue around, paint it on, and then glue it to the center of your template. So that is step one. Okay, our next step is going to be threading and setting up our beading needle. So super important to do this, obviously. Can't bead without a needle. So you're going to take an arm's width or a wingspan, I like to call it, a floss. It gives you, I guess, a few feet of it for sure. There's probably almost 4 feet of floss there. 3 for sure. And most floss is flat. So what you want to do is hold it quite close to the end, so there's just a little wee bit of floss sticking out from the end of your fingers. Straighten it out, flatten it out so that it is a perfect thin flat end. And then obviously you want to stand that flat floss up to orient it perfectly with the vertical eye of your needle. Takes a little bit of practice, but eventually you can get it first shot like that. Now, what you want to do for your setup now is you want to have a long end and a short end on your floss. Your long end is going to be more than twice the length of your short end to start, and your short end will remain open, and we are going to tie off the long end. So that long half of your floss we're going to tie. And what we're going to use for that is a surgeon's knot. So essentially what happens here is you go to make your regular knot, like you would always make, right? Your classic knot. But then before you pull it tight, what you're going to do is wrap that floss through again a second time, and then even a third time you can pull it through. So now what you're left with is 3 knots all in one spot here. Now when you go to pull that through, you end up with a perfect triple knot in exactly the same place. Trying to do one knot, pull it tight, and then try to subsequently line up 2 more knots against it is almost impossible. You'll never get them exactly perfect, but with the surgeon's knot, you will. So now you will have your needle with a short end that is open. That is your safety net. If you make a mistake or get all screwed up on your project, you can just remove your needle by that end and then back out your floss. So that's super important. So we keep our safety net open end. And then you have a long end, right? This is your working piece. And it has a double or triple surgeon's knot at the end. And then of course, you can just trim off any of that excess at the end so that you have just a tiny, tiny tail past your knot. And then your needle's set up, your template's set up, and we're ready to rock and roll. We can start beading. Okay, so now we're actually ready to begin our beading process. So first things first, we're going to be doing our outline. So we are going to work on the outer black line that goes all the way around our leaf. That's step one. We're going to do these interior veins in a different color, right? So stick with this outline first that circumnavigates your leaf, and we're going to be doing that in our dark orange. You're going to have two oranges, a light and a dark. You're going to want to use the dark one for this. So step one is you're going to be going from underneath your piece and popping out somewhere on this outline. It doesn't matter exactly where you start. I'm going to start down here, kind of in the crook of where the leaf meets the stem. So I'm coming up from the bottom and pulling my thread all the way through. So now my knot's at the underneath of my piece, and I'm starting here off to the side. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up a few beads. The amount of beads you pick up doesn't really matter too much on like a straight line, but the idea is you got to plan it out so that your beads end at the end of the line you're going to make, and then you can turn a corner with it with a new piece, right? So I could probably either do 3 and maybe another 2 or 3 to finish this line here, right? And then I'm going to need to turn this corner and only maybe use a couple beads, and then I can got this big long loose wavy straight after that. I could pick up probably 5 at a time. So the amount of beads you pick up is dependent on the line you're trying to complete, how sharp of corners you've got. So you've got to kind of build this intuition as to how many beads is the right amount of beads. I'm going to pick up 3 just for the sake of showing you this process. Okay? So I scooped up 3 beads. I slide them all the way down so that they are now on my piece here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my thumb and the thread in one hand to steer my beads to where I want them to go, right? So I can steer them like this. So I tuck them down here. I'm just going to adjust my focus here. So what I'm going to do now, okay, is at the end of this last bead, I'm going to poke my needle down right on the line. So you can see here, I've poked my needle down through the top, coming out the bottom, at the end of my 3rd bead, right on the line. I can now pull my slack all the way through, and I've now got 3 beads side by side, perfectly on the line. And my next step is to go from underneath again and to pop up between beads 1 and 2, right on the line. That's the trick, is that if you are popping up or going in off the line, then obviously your beads will not be in a straight line and they won't follow your outline very well. So what I've done now is I've come up in between beads 1 and 2 on the line. So you can see my thread here has come through in between beads 1 and 2. My final move is to go forward facing in the direction that I'm beading through the remainder of my beads. So this doesn't matter whether you pick up 3 beads or 5 beads or 7 beads. You're always going to pop up in between bead 1 and 2, and then you're going to go in the direction you're beading through the remainder of your beads, however many that is. You then pull all the way through. Sometimes your floss gets hooked up. And then you can do what I like to call the thumb roll, where with one hand you pull on your thread, and the other hand you use your thumb, and you kind of roll the beads a little bit under your thumb, and this tightens them right up. If you do that at the end of each one of your little beading repetitions, you will have a very tight piece where all of your beads are firmly adhered to your piece. It'll make an overall more structurally sound piece. And you can always tell beading pieces where people don't tug and thumb roll their beads because they look kind of loose and wobbly and you can see thread in between. So important. So that's what it. And now my thread is coming out the end of my last bead and is ready to pick up another pile. So I'll grab another couple beads here to finish off this line to show you what that looks like. So I'm going to start by picking up 2 beads because I know I don't have very far to go on that little line. I'll slide them down, and this is an important skill, is gauging how far to go. So now, if you look, those 2 extra beads have taken me perfectly right to the end of that line. So that's how many I'm going to tack down. So again, I'm going to go down right on the line at the end of where I want my beads to go, right at the end of that point of the leaf. Then I pull all the slack through. Then you can have a look and see, oh yeah, perfect. They're right on the line. They finish right at the end. Now I only tack 2 beads down, so I'm going to come up between 1 and 2. So you can see here I've popped up on the line in between beads 1 and 2. I'm going to pull all the slack through, and then I'm going to go through my last bead because there's only 2 that went down, so I'm going through only 1. Then we pull tight. We do a little thumb roll and a tug, and there we have it. My beads are in line, following the curvature of that bottom line I wanted to, and they've made it right to the end of that point. Now I'll give you a trick right here, right now, because there's a lot of points obviously on a maple leaf, is what I could do is I could just turn the corner and start working back down this little piece here. But when I turn that corner, what would happen is that my bead, or my string, right, would pull that bead around, and I'd end up with this rounded edge, and I would not end up with a very nice point. So what I'm going to do, and you can do this at the end of each one of your little points, okay, is you're going to go back down from the top through to the bottom at the end of that bead, right? You're going to pull all your slack through, give her a little tug, and now we're underneath again, and our line is still straight like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop back up right on the line, right where I want to start my next little turn. I can pull my string all the way through the top. So now I am on my new little line, right, coming up through the bottom. And now when I start working in this direction, I might only need 2 beads to span that little gap. But what's going to happen is it's not going to pull my other nice line over. And that's how you achieve nice points, right? So that'll give you a nice pointed leaf ends. instead of rounded ones. So now again, I can pick up, I think maybe 2 beads ought to do it. So we'll scoop up 2 beads. You can always check, slide them down, right? Slide them down and then put them on the line and see what they look like. I can see here that they're going to do just great. I have to work in reverse here to show you. But my 2 beads is going to perfectly make that little corner. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use 2. Right? So you have to guess and kind of test them out, right? Trial and error. I'm going to poke down through at the end of those 2 beads, pull all my slack through. There are my 2 beads sitting in place. I pop up on the line right after my first bead, so between bead 1 and 2. Pull all my slack, and then go forward through my last bead, right? You're always going forward you're going through the beads in the direction that you're beading. Always remember that. Don't go backwards through a bead or else you'll get all tangled up. Right? Give a little thumb roll, a little tug, and then now you can see, right, that my corner has remained nice and tight. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to pop down through at the end of this one, then come back through from underneath right on the start of my next line. That won't bow out my new little edge here. And then I'm going to trace all the way up to this point. Tack that down, turn this corner, tack it down. So it's a lot of tacking at the end of each one of your points. But if you take the extra time to do that, your piece is going to have nice pointed tips that's going to look really nice, and they won't all be rounded, right? So that's going to be the difference between kind of an average looking piece and a really crisp, sharp looking piece that looks like it was done by a pro. Okay, so I'm going to continue tracing this, and I'll show you what it looks like when we get to the end. Then we'll start working on our inside veins. Okay, good luck. Okay, so here we have it. This is the outline piece. Now something I want to say is I learned by experience here on my first go of this leaf that you can see I came around starting here and worked myself around clockwise. And what I would actually suggest is you can see that the points all look really nice here, working from the bottom up, right? When you get to this midpoint up at the top, don't continue around because it's much harder to make these points look really good working downwards. I would work all the way up to the top and then stick your needle in, pull your floss through the back, and pop back up on the other side over here, right at this point. And then I would go up the other side and then join it at the center because you can see how much obviously better it looks on this side versus this side. So I learned that while going around. It's very hard to make these points look really nice coming downwards just by the nature of how you line them up. So do the first side, come to the top, dip the thread under, pop back out at the bottom over here, and then work up your other side and join them at the center. You'll end up with a much better piece. And that's what I'll do on my other earring. So it'll look better. That's the thing with earrings. You always get one really nice one, which is the second one you've made, and then one tester, which is the first one you made. So I'm now gonna, you can see I've popped my thread through at the top of one of my vein lines, and I'm actually just gonna run it all the way straight down to the bottom, right to the end of this stem. So I'm going to run that all the way down to the bottom, and then from that center point, I'm going to run out my little other veins there that finger off the main stem, and those will be done in your pale yellow. So I'm going to start working on that, and I'll show you as I progress. Something also to mention kind of quickly, you can see I started beating down my stem, or my central vein here. When I got to the point where I was going to put the stem down, I was just going to use 3 beads. 4 got a little bit long, and you'll want like a thin little piece sticking out too much. So what I actually did, though, was I peeled off a lot of that, that paper template underneath, because it was just a hair wider than 1 row of beads. So what it actually ended up doing is I could see the black template line underneath. So before tacking down these final beads, I peeled off that top layer so there's no ink lines anymore. And that way, when I finish this, you won't be able to see any ink underneath of it. So little tip there. Okay, so here we go. You can see I've outlined this stem. It's all the way through. It extends straight through to the little stem at the bottom. All the little fingers are done here. And now what our next step is going to be is obviously going to be to fill all this negative space. And what we're going to do is we're going to do this in a way that is, I would like to say, kind of like painting with beads, where we've got our dark color of orange that we're going to use, but then we've also got a second tone. So I'll just pop here. So we've got this lighter orange, right, that we're working with. So dark orange, light orange, and we're going to use like a 2-tone effect here to fill this. So what we're going to do is you're going to start from the corners here and work your way out from the veins out towards the tips of the leaves and work outwards. And what you're going to do, okay, is there's no exact formula for this because it's kind of like painting, but you're going to start with your lighter color. You're going to start by putting lighter colors towards the core of the leaf, and as you work it out, you're going to slowly intersperse and switch over to dark colors. So basically those darker colors are going to meet with the outline of the leaf and give this effect that the light fades out into the dark. And that's what we're looking for. It's going to give a painted look. It's going to make it 2-tone. It's going to make it look like it's a leaf truly in transition of color. Okay, so I'll kind of start working on this and start pulling it out, and then I'll show you what my progress looks like, and you can kind of see what that effect is starting to look like. But otherwise, we're getting quite close. Okay, so now you can see I'm beginning to work outwards from my central kind of intersection here, and I'm working out in lines from the bottom. And I'm just going to run them kind of stacked all the way out and work my way all the way up. So started here at the bottom, up, 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 and I've been running obviously out in lines like this. And if you notice, what I've done is interspersed, like I'll have, say, 4 lights, a dark, a light, and then darks, and that gives that fading effect, right, where you can intersperse the odd dark through your lights as you work it out, and it'll make it look like a gradual kind of a brush stroke where there's some fading happening. Now, something that you're going to run into here, and I know people who have beaded more in the past have run into this issue as well, is that because you have converging lines who meet on different angles, right, sometimes you're left with gaps. And I've been working on a technique to kind of, how do we fix this? And I've done it over here on this little point, and I'm probably going to want to do it maybe, say, in here, or actually here. There's a little hole. right? You can see there's a hole here, right in there, and I can't really put a bead in it, but it's a gap, right? So what I've been working on is trying to cinch those beads in. So what I'll do is I'll pop up a little bit away from the beads in that gap, right? You can see I'm over here. It's the yellows that I'm looking to work on. And what I'll do is I'll pull my slack through, and then what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to kind of capture a space between two of those beads and go in on a good angle underneath them. Okay, so this is something that's a little tough to show, but you can see I've come down with my needle on an angle between two beads that are kind of in the center of the gap I'm looking to rectify. Then I can pull my needle through, and I'll show you kind of what happens here. I'll put no tension on it right now, and then we'll see what it does, right? So as I am pulling my slack in, I want to make sure that that loop lands. You can see it there. I want the loop to land right in between the two beads I'm looking to fix. You slowly pull, it'll pop between the beads, and then now what can happen, right? You see that little gap? Now when I pull on it, I can drag the beads into that gap. Right? I pulled them and it's actually bowed the beads and pulled them into that gap. You might not always want this happening if you're working with absolute straight lines, but with these kind of fingers here on this leaf, I want them to have a little bit of sway to them. So what I can do is kind of bow them in here and there just a little bit to help fill those gaps. And where you can really use that is at the end of these points. That's what I did with this point right here. I went into the middle of this point, and then I threw a little lash around either side in between the two beads at the points, and I pulled them in, I dragged them in so that it would tighten up, because again, I couldn't fit a bead in that little hole at the end. So this is something you're going to need to practice with, experiment with, and kind of learn how to do. But it's a great way to do it. It's been working for myself thus far on this project. This is the first time I've I've done it a couple times in the past to fix mistakes, but this is my first shot, like really trying to kind of use it all throughout a piece to see what kind of effect it makes. So you will have converging lines, you will have little gaps here and there. Try this technique, see if you can figure it out, and you might be able to draw in some of those gaps, pull those beads into the little gap that you've got. So give her a whirl. I'm going to keep working on this and I'll show you where I get. Okay folks, you can see here is the piece. It's not quite finished yet, but I wanted to show you still some gaps just to kind of see what that looks like as you start working on it. The biggest suggestion I would make, now that I've actually been putting away at this, is try your absolute best to run with pre-existing lines. So you've got these yellow veins that are running out here in all directions, right? I would say hug up and run with one. And then you can line the next one up and run it straight out. And then go one up from it, and then try and connect to one of these other lines. When you start getting into these little nooks here, you almost have to run out, hit the edge of your outline, and then turn, and then start to pull up along with your outline. So you've got to try and flow with pre-existing lines. You can see all over here I've done the same thing. I've run out along that vein. I finished the vein off here. Then I moved up and went beside it. Then the next one I actually hit and turned and started to actually follow into my outline. right? And that's what gives like a look of flow. So now when you look at the piece, you can see that painted look that I'm starting to talk about, right? Where your lights fade off into darks, and it's very obvious that it looks like it's a two-tone affair, and that there is, that change happening in the leaf that we're trying so hard to capture here. So give that a shot. I'm going to continue along, fill this in, and then we'll move on from there. Okay, folks, here we have it. Get a good look. This is the finished fill, so you can see that fading effect, especially at a little bit of a distance, achieved, right? Yellow fading out, slowly speckling its way into the dark. Now, I will say this was definitely a challenge. There was tons of instances where I had to sit there and scratch my head and play the game of, do I add another bead? Do I leave it a gap? What do I do? Do I pull that in later? So there's still a couple little amendments I may make to this as far as like just pulling beads, side to side to fill a couple gaps. But overall, these things are meant to be enjoyed at a bit of a distance, and it looks slick from far away. And that's the main idea. So the next thing we're going to be doing, cutting it out all the way around, being mindful of not chopping any of our floss stitching at the edges. That's the biggest mistake you could make at this point, and it's pretty catastrophic if you try and cut so close along your fabric that you actually snip a stitch or two, and then the beads come whooshing out. You got to find a way to tie off those ends so that more beads don't go flying, and then you have to repair. So you don't want to do that. Otherwise, we're going to cut that out. Then we'll be looking into attaching our hardware on the back. Our post-back earring hardware is going to go on actually sandwiched in between our leather layers. So we'll get into that next. Okay, so now I've got my piece sitting on my piece of leather, the backing, right? You want that fuzzy side to be facing the back of your piece, like that'll be touching your fabric stabilizer, so that what is exposed is this nice shiny side. That's what you want as the out-facing backing of your piece. So fuzzy side is where you're going to be gluing. It adheres much better to the glue. So what we're going to do is we've got our little piece of our little post back, right? That's going to be what makes this an earring. So what we need to do is, if you can imagine, the post back is going to be going kind of here in the middle of our top lobe of our leaf. But obviously it's going to be sandwiched in the back here. So what we need to do is come up with a little trick to allow us to get the placement right on this. So what I'm going to do is I line it up so that my piece, it's not running out of leather anywhere, right? It's going to fit perfectly here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold that sturdy at the top so that the bottom can open up. And then what I'm going to do here is use my glue. I'm using Fabri-Tac. You don't have to. You can use some sort of, good quality kind of super glue. We'll do the trick for this. You want something relatively well adhering, but we're going to remember that we're edging all the way around this, so it will be stitched all the way around the outside. So it's really not the glue that's holding your leather on, it'll be the stitching, but the glue definitely seals it up, it firms up the piece a little bit for structural sake, and it holds that leather in place while you edge. So allowing my super slow Fabri-Tac to work its way down the tube here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my Fabri-Tac underneath the bottom half here. of my piece. This stuff is super thick, it takes a minute to come out. There it goes. I'm just spreading it around on the bottom half of this piece. That will leave my top half open, and I'm doing that for a good reason. So now that's kind of smeared around, I'm going to allow it now to glue itself on there, and I'll give it a minute to firm up. So I'm allowing that to do its thing. Fabric tack doesn't take very long to dry, so we'll just hang tight for a quick minute and it'll be good. Now the goal of this, okay, is now looking at my piece. The top part is open like this, right? See that? So it's glued into place, but the top half is flappy. And that's what we want. Because what we need to do now is we need to mark out where our little post back is going to be, because we want it centered to our piece. So you can take a pen or something like that. And what the idea now is, you got to play this game where from the back you can't see where you want to make your hole for the post. So you kind of need to do this thing where you hold your piece like this, you kind of pull back your leather, and you have to almost kind of guess where the center of that lobe is going to be, because we want it to sit maybe right about here, right in the center kind of bulk of that lobe, because that post back has got a flat section on it, and you want it to have some room, right? You don't want that flat section to be right at the edge like that, right? It's a bit sketchy to have it so far to the top. So we want it to sit towards the end of the lobe, but with a little bit of meat there to bite into. But obviously it's going to be underneath here, facing out, right? So now we play that game where we try and line up the center of our lobe and make a little dot on the leather. So I've done that, where now you can see there's a little pen dot I've made on the leather. And the idea is you kind of got to do this thing where you peek inside and look, where's that going to line up? Is it going to be in the right spot? Once you feel confident with that, which I do, you're then going to take your needle and you're going to poke through the leather right on that little dot you've made, which you've decided is going to be the center of that lobe. Once you poke through, you want to just kind of do a little bit of stretching around, not too much or else you'll break your needle, but you want to just kind of like loosen up and just work in that little hole you've made so it kind of stretches itself out, right? So there we go, that hole is good and solid now. Now when I pull it out, I've got a tiny little hole on that spot. This now is the hole that you're going to use. You might have to kind of force it in there a little bit, but this is the hole you're going to use to pop your backing through. And have to find it, you might have to work around a little bit, but it's there somewhere. It can be hard to get through, but it's there. Leather's stretchy, so it will accommodate. There we go. It just popped through. All right, so bring it all the way in, and now you can kind of do the mock lineup, right? Where when you put it flat, the back of the post should line up in the center of that leaf's lobe, which mine definitely has. It's in the middle, just like that, right? So you can see there's my post, and it sits in the middle of my lobe, and that's what I want. Now what you can do is you can glue the top half. Just going to let my glue slowly drip its way down here. And then you're going to do the same thing. You're going to put your glue on the top half. There we go. This will firm up the piece, hold it all together, and also is going to hold your post back right in the right spot as it dries. So you can kind of, leather's fairly forgiving, so you know, stretch it around a little bit. You can look at your piece and just line it up so that it dries. Right now I've got it so when it dries, my post is exactly in the center of that top lobe. Right, so set it, get it organized, get it straight. Take a moment to do this. And then you can kind of squeeze a little bit. Make sure you've got any little bubbles out, make sure the adhesion is nice. And then you're going to let that piece hang. Just let it sit there for a few minutes, depending on what kind of glue you're using, so that all settles. But otherwise, once that's done, you can then cut out your leather, trim all the leather to the shape of your piece, and then you will be left with an earring. And then the last thing we have to do is edge it, and then we'll be done. So one more step. Of course, this is for one earring, then you have to redo everything again. That's sort of the tough thing about earrings, is you finally finish your piece and you take that big breath, and then you have to do another one. And you want it to be as close to the same as this one. So that's the tough part. So anyway, that's it. I'm going to trim this off and then I'll show you how to edge. Okay, so here's the piece ready to be edged. You can see it's trimmed quite well, but I haven't snipped any stitches. On the back side, my post is sticking out pretty well bang on in the middle of the piece. It's glued in there, sandwiched in, and can't come out, especially not once it's edged. And that's what we're going to do next. So first things first, your needle setup and your thread, absolutely the same thing as it's always been. You have a shorter open end and you have a longer end that is triple knotted with the surgeon's knot. The trick with this though is you really want to get a nice long piece of thread, right? Like a full wingspan of thread, because you do not want to run out of thread as you are edging your piece. You want to be able to finish the entire thing in one fell swoop, because it's kind of annoying to, in a nice way, tie off and restart your edging. It's way more solid and way more uniform if you can do it in one single piece of thread. So that's what you're going to shoot for. So to start, what you're going to do is, everyone kind of beads in a certain direction. I'm left-handed, so I tend to bead, or edge specifically clockwise, right, working this way around the piece. If you're right-handed, people tend to go counterclockwise, because for me, holding in my left hand, I kind of bead this way, so it makes sense that my needle's going that direction. Whereas righties, it makes more sense to work counterclockwise. So choose your direction based on your hand. And then what we're going to do is we're going to find a spot that has an opening where you can pull back your leather and expose a piece of stabilizer. Every piece will have this somewhere that you can pull back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold that back, and I'm going to plunge my needle in as close as I can to however far back you can pull your leather, and then you're going to come through on a significant kind of shallow angle. It's hard to show, but you can see I'm on a very light angle here. And then you're going to pull your thread through all the way. And what will happen then is your knot is now going to be sunken into your leather. So you can kind of get it flat. And then when you lay your leather back down, it hides your knot completely. You can't see it at all. It's hidden in there. And you'll edge it right in. So first things first, you're going to pick up one bead. And now we're using a green here. It'll give it a nice, it's a complementary color to these oranges. And then what it'll kind of be is it'll remind us of, in the background, those green leaves that we hope to see again in the spring. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to start. So we're coming out the top now, just on the edge of our stabilizer. Right, that's where we are, out the top. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go around the back, and just beside where I came through, I'm going to go back up through both the leather and the stabilizer, just on the edge. Like so. You can see I'm popping up right beside where I went in, just off to the side of it. I'm going to pull all my slack through. This is where the little pliers come in handy when you're going through leather and stabilizer. And now what we have is there's one bead kind of suspended on the edge of our piece. Now what we're going to do is we are going to straighten out this bead so that it's going to kind of go in the direction we want it to go. So when we're edging, the trick is whichever way you're going to edge. So I'm going to hold my piece like this, and I'm edging clockwise because I'm a lefty. So what that means is that I'm going to straighten my bead out, going in through the back of it, and my needle is going to be going in the direction that I'm edging. So that first one's always a little bit kind of frustrating to work with because you got to like tack it down into place, and when you're edging, they very much so depend on each other, those beads, to keep each other straight. So I'm now have my thread coming out the front of the bead in the direction I want to go. Getting the first couple in is the hardest. So now I'm going to pick up my piece, and I'm going to go through the stabilizer on a light angle, and then also try and catch some leather. You can see I've gone through on a bit of an angle here. I know it's a mess to look at right now, but I've come through the top of my piece on an angle so that I would catch a bit of leather at the bottom. You're going to pull all the way through, like so. And then you're going to, again, go through the back of your bead, pull all your slack, give it a tug so that it kind of straightens out. Getting the first couple in is hard, but you can see now I've got two beads sitting side by side on the edge of the piece, and I'm just going to continue working in this way and work my way all the way around the piece. I'll give you a little kind of rundown again once I get a few more on there. I can show you even better the beading edging technique. So that's how you kind of get started. You got to get a few running because they really support each other. Okay, so here we are starting to actually get some of that edging done. So you can have a good look there. So it can be difficult in a few spots here, I'm going to be honest. At the ends of these points, on these outside corners, right, these points, you almost need to go through the same kind of hole through the stabilizer right at the very tip of that point and use it to lash on your kind of 1, 2, 3 beads that span the outside edge of your corner. And you'll see that you almost need to keep going into that same point at the very tip 3 times or more to kind of string all those beads nice and tightly around the outside. And then just go through on different angles and grab different pieces of the leather behind it to kind of give you that wraparound effect around that point. So that can be a challenging thing to work through. And the other aspect too is on the inside corners. It can also be tough. You see, like I've went all the way to the very corner, like all the way in on one side, and then I kind of like skipped up onto the other line and started going up from there. So in that very in this very corner here, right, I went all the way to the end here and then jumped onto my other line and started working up, so you can see that. So a couple little things to bear in mind as you work around this edging. So it takes a little bit of time, a little bit of care, but you can certainly work your way through it. The thing I always say too, remember to give after each bead, give it a nice little tug and make sure you keep them tight. You don't want slack in there because you'll never be able to pull that slack out, which can be really difficult. So once more, I'll just show you, right, my floss is coming out of the center of the bead that I just laid down, and it's coming out in the direction I want to bead. I pick up a singular bead, just slide it just past your needle, and then you're going to go in through the stabilizer, right beside the bead you just put down, go through on a slight angle so that you get a little bit of meat on your leather there. You want to go in just like 1 millimeter or 2 into your leather, into the edge of it, and then you can pull through. Sometimes you can get it barehanded, or you might have to grab the pliers to help you out. And then once you've got that pulled through, your bead's kind of sitting in a funny place, not looking like the rest, and you need to go through it in the direction of the rest of your beads. You'll know right away if you've gone in the wrong end because it'll spin the bead around and it'll be laying kind of flat on its side instead of standing up stacked like the others. So it becomes pretty obvious when you go through the wrong way. And that's okay, you can just back your thread up. You can back it right back through the bead and then try again, go in the other direction. Sometimes it takes a couple tries when you get kind of mixed up. And even I get mixed up all the time. I'll go through the wrong side and it'll kind of spin it around. So anyway, that's that. Then you just pull it through tight and everything will just remain stacked in a nice little row. So that's edging. I'm going to continue along and I'll show you when we get to the end here what it all looks like. Okay? Okay, so here we go. You can see the piece is totally edged now. But the last step I wanted to show you is in here. So what I've done is I just put in right here my last bead. And so my first bead I started with is right beside it. So I've basically come full circle and I've come right up to the bead I started at. So I've come all the way around the circle. Right, I can't fit any more beads, so I've come back to the start point. Now how I'm going to tie this off now is my first bead I'd put down, bead number 1, I'm going to actually go through that bead now. So you go through bead number 1, pull all your slack through, and essentially what you do here by doing that is now I have my last bead and my first bead sort of seamed together, if you will, because I went through, right, I was edging this way, I went through that first bead. So it essentially ties them together. Now what I need to do is actually tie off my string. So what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to go into my stabilizer just on the edge of it, kind of like in between the beads. You can see here I've gone in just in that little margin area, just above my edging, but just below my actual bead work. Right, so I'm going to go in on a very shallow angle here. And the reason for that is when you push in on that shallow angle, sometimes you got to just be patient, work it in, because on such a shallow angle, you're hitting a lot of material. So it can become a little hard to push, but just wiggle it through. Right, you might need to use a tool or something like that. But then what you'll eventually be able to do, the outcome here, is to hide our little knot, our little tie-off knot, somewhere in the middle of the piece. So I'm just going to keep pushing here and I'll show you what happens. Okay, there we go. I've just started to pop out. So now, as you can see, it gets hard to push. There it is. I've now popped out somewhere in the middle of my piece. I might have went a little too far and I'm kind of on the other side, but somewhere in the middle-ish is where you want to get to. Now it's really nice to have pliers to be able to pull this through. So I can grab that little tip of my needle and then I can pull this all the way through. And now what happens is my string is now sticking out in the center of my piece somewhere. There's no visible knots here on the front or side or edge, right? So now what I'm going to do is you can take your needle off, right? So my needle's off. And now what I'm going to do is my surgeon's knot, like we've gotten used to doing. So my 1, 2, 3 times around in a single knot, which gives you something like this, where you've got 3 knots on your loop. And then what I tend to do here then, to get my tie off right up against it, is I make essentially like a, picture like a coat hanger shape, right? I use my thumb and middle finger on one, and then I'm holding the other end. It essentially makes the shape of a coat hanger, if you can picture that, right? There's our little coat hanger. All right, so when you've made that little coat hanger shape, what I then do is take my index finger and hold it right there. I now have my loose end string, and my nail is holding that knot there. And now as I pull, 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 tug all your slack through, you end up with a triple knot. So I have a triple knot perfectly right at my surface. No slack, nothing like that. So that's basically a perfect tie off. You can snip off your little end there. And that's basically it. There's our earring done. You can see even at a little bit of a distance, that fade really kind of comes to life. It looks very apparent, like a real leaf. You've got a little backing as well that you can slide onto your back. And there you have it. That is a fall maple leaf earring ready to go. And the discouraging thing, encouraging but discouraging, is you've done one, and now you start back over and you do the entire thing over again, and then you get a pair of earrings, because as it stands we only have one, right? So there you are, that's it. So good luck with that. Thanks so much for beading along, and I hope yours turns out well. And if you have any issues, right, obviously you can contact me, and we have our Zoom as well, where we can work through any little issues or little hiccups you might have on your piece. So there you go. Good luck.